The biting wind did not just blow through the city. It seemed to hunt for the smallest things left exposed, cutting through coats and scarves to settle deep into the bone. It was the kind of cold that made people walk fast, heads down, eyes narrowed, their breath puffing out in angry white clouds that vanished the second they left their lips. For most people in the city, this was just an inconvenience, a reason to complain about the weather or turn up the heat in their cars. But for the two small figures huddled in the alleyway next to the large brick building, the wind was a living thing that wanted to hurt them. They were twins, though you had to look closely to see the resemblance under the layers of dirt and grime. They were 10 years old, but they looked much smaller. Their faces were thin, their cheekbones sharp and protruding, and their skin had taken on a grayish pallor from days without proper food. Their clothes were too big, hanging off their shoulders like rags on a scarecrow. They had found the coats in a dumpster behind a charity shop 2 weeks ago, and while they were thin and tattered, they were the only things keeping the boys from freezing to death on the pavement. The older twin, let's call him Leo, sat with his back against the rough brick wall. He had his arm wrapped tightly around his brother, who was shivering violently even in his sleep. Leo wasn't sleeping. He couldn't. If he closed his eyes, the cold would win. He had to stay awake to make sure his brother was still breathing, to rub his arms when the shivering stopped, which was a dangerous sign. Leo stared out at the street, watching the legs of the people walking by. He saw shiny leather shoes, clean boots, and expensive sneakers. It felt like watching a different world. It had been 3 months since their world had fallen apart. Before that, there had been a small apartment, the smell of baking bread, and the sound of laughter. There had been a mother who sang while she worked, and a father who came home tired but smiling. Then came the accident that took them both in an instant. And the boys went from being loved children to being numbers in a system that didn't have enough room for them. The shelter was full, the relatives were gone, and the social worker, with tears in her eyes, had nowhere else to take them. So they ran. They ran because staying in a crowded, dangerous waiting room felt worse than the cold streets. At least on the streets, they had each other. A heavy rumble broke the silence of the alley. It came from the stomach of the younger twin Milo. He stirred, whimpering in his sleep as his body cried out for energy. Leo tightened his grip. It's okay, he whispered softly, though he knew it wasn't okay. Go back to sleep. Milo opened his eyes slowly. They were large, brown eyes that looked too old for his face. He looked up at his brother, confusion clouding his gaze for a moment before the harsh reality of their life rushed back in. I dreamed we were home, Milo croaked, his voice raspy from the cold. There was hot chocolate. I know, Leo said, forcing a smile that hurt his dry, cracked lips. Just stay dreaming. It's warmer there. I can't feel my toes, Leo, Milo said quietly. Leo grabbed his brother's feet through the torn fabric of his sneakers. They were ice cold. He began to rub them furiously, trying to force the blood to move again. Don't say that. Don't say you can't feel them. Once you say it, it gets worse. Think about the summer. Think about the park. The park is far away, Milo mumbled. Closing his eyes again, Leo worked on his brother's feet until his own fingers went numb. He looked around the alley. It was dark, lit only by a flickering street lamp at the entrance that buzzed with an annoying sound. Snow was starting to fall, not in big, soft flakes, but in a hard, sideways sleet that stung when it hit the skin. They couldn't stay here. If the snow piled up while they slept, they might not wake up. Hello, come on, Leo said, gently shaking his brother. We have to move. We have to find a warmer spot, Milo groaned. He didn't want to move. His body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. I'm so tired. I know. But if we stay here, the ice wins. Remember what Dad used to say? Motion is life. We have to move. It took a lot of effort to get Milo to his feet. He swayed for a moment, dizzy from hunger and the exhaustion of walking all day. Leo grabbed his arm, throwing it over his shoulder, and took most of his brother's weight. They stumbled out of the alley and onto the main sidewalk. The wind hit them like a physical blow. The street was busy despite the weather. People were rushing home from work or heading out to dinner. The sidewalk was crowded, but it was as if the twins were invisible. A woman in a long wool coat walked right past them, talking on her phone and laughing. A man in a business suit stepped around them without even looking down. Annoyed that they were blocking his path, Leo pulled his brother closer to the buildings, trying to stay in the narrow shadows where the wind was slightly less fierce. They walked for 2 blocks, their only goal to keep moving. But Leo's strength was fading fast. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He had given his last half-eaten apple to Milo the night before. Then a smell hit them. It was so powerful, it stopped them in their tracks. It was the smell of rich, salty broth, roasting garlic, fresh herbs, and baking bread. It came from a large restaurant a few doors down. The sign above the door was fancy, glowing with a warm yellow light that looked like heaven against the blue-gray of the winter evening. It was called the Gilded Spoon. Through the large glass windows, Leo could see golden chandeliers and white tablecloths. He saw waiters carrying silver platters piled high with food. He saw people sitting in comfortable chairs lifting spoons to their mouths. Steam rising from their bowls, Milo moaned, a low sound of pure agony. He stopped walking and just stared through the glass. "Leo," he whispered. "Look, I know," Leo said. He swallowed hard, his mouth watering painfully even as his stomach cramped. "Come on, Milo. Don't look. It makes it hurt more." "I just want 1 sip," Milo said, his voice trembling. "Just 1. Please, Leo. I'm so hungry it feels like I'm eating myself from the inside." Leo looked at his brother's face. He saw the tears mixing with the dirt on Milo's cheeks. He looked back at the warm restaurant, then down at his own rags. He knew they couldn't go in there. They would be thrown out before they even reached a table. The smell of the food was taunting them, a cruel joke played by a city that didn't care if they lived or died. "Just stand near the vent," Leo said, pointing to a grate near the wall where hot air from the kitchen was escaping. "Stand there and breathe it in. It'll trick your stomach." They shuffled over to the vent. The air coming out was warm and smelled strongly of onions and butter. It was a small mercy, but it wasn't enough. The heat warmed their faces, but their bodies were still freezing. The hunger wasn't a dull ache anymore. It was a sharp, twisting pain in their guts. They stood there for a long time, looking like 2 ghosts haunting the entrance of a place where they didn't belong. People walked past them, entering the restaurant with happy smiles, leaving the restaurant with full bellies. The doorman stood inside the glass door, his arms crossed, watching the street with a bored expression. He hadn't noticed them yet, but Leo knew it was only a matter of time. "We can't stay here," Leo said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He'll see us." "I don't care," Milo said, leaning his forehead against the cold brick. "I'd rather get yelled at and be warm for a minute than freeze to death around the corner." Leo leaned against the wall next to him. He felt tears pricking his own eyes now, but he fought them back. He had to be strong. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine despair. How much longer could they do this? How many more nights of cold and hunger could his small brother survive? The front door of the restaurant swung open, and a wave of laughter and loud jazz music spilled out onto the street, along with a massive gust of delicious heat. A group of well-dressed people walked out, bundling up their scarves. They didn't even glance at the 2 boys pressed against the wall as the door began to close. The doorman stepped forward to hold it open for a customer coming in. He spotted the twins. His expression changed from boredom to annoyance. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his heavy shoes clacking on the pavement. "Hey," the doorman shouted, his voice gruff. "You 2. Move along. Get away from the window. You're blocking the entrance." Milo flinched and tried to hide behind Leo. Leo stepped forward, putting himself between the angry man and his brother. "We're just warming up," Leo said, his voice shaking. "We'll go." "Now," the man snapped, "go beg somewhere else. You're scaring the customers." Leo looked at the man, then back at the beautiful piano sitting in the corner of the restaurant window. It was a shiny black grand piano, polished to a shine. It looked out of place in such a harsh world. He felt a strange urge to touch it, to sit at it, but he knew that was a foolish dream. "We're going," Leo said. He grabbed Milo's arm. "Come on, Milo." But Milo didn't move. He was staring at the people inside, His eyes locked on a waiter carrying a tray of steaming bowls. "Leo," Milo whispered. "I can't move my legs. I'm too weak." The panic rose in Leo's chest. This was it. The end of the line. They were going to collapse right here on the sidewalk. And then the door opened again, and the restaurant owner stepped out. The man who stepped out of the warm glow of the restaurant was a stark contrast to the shivering boys huddled by the wall. He was a large man, wearing a crisp white shirt that strained slightly at the buttons and a dark vest that looked expensive. He had a thick mustache and a red face that suggested he was used to shouting orders and getting exactly what he wanted. This was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the Gilded Spoon. He had stepped out to inspect the valet parking situation. But he stopped dead when he saw the scene near his front window. His eyes narrowed as he took in the dirty coats, the matted hair, and the bare, cold skin of the twins. To him, they weren't two hungry children. They were a problem. They were a smudge on the pristine picture he was trying to paint for his wealthy customers. He hated the way they looked at the window, like stray dogs hoping for a scrap. It made the people eating inside feel guilty, and when people felt guilty, they didn't order dessert. "Thought I told you to scram," Mr. Henderson barked, waving a hand dismissively as if he were shooing away a fly. "This isn't a shelter. Go find a park bench somewhere else." Leo tried to pull Milo up, but Milo's legs had turned to jelly. He slid down the wall a little bit, his eyes never leaving the restaurant door. "Please, sir," Leo stammered, his teeth chattering so hard he almost bit his tongue. "Just a little water? Or anything? My brother hasn't eaten in 2 days." Mr. Henderson let out a loud, exasperated sigh that turned into a cloud of white steam. He walked over to them, his presence looming and threatening. "I don't run a charity here. I run a business. You two are bad for business. You look terrible, you smell terrible, and you're blocking my entrance." A small group of diners had just left the restaurant and were waiting on the sidewalk for their cars. They stopped to watch the interaction, clutching their coats tight. Among them was a woman wrapped in a luxurious fur coat. She had a sharp, pinched face and eyes that looked at the world as if everything in it was slightly beneath her. She looked at the twins with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "Just give them a crust of bread, Henderson," the woman sneered, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "so they stop staring at us. It's ruining my appetite." Mr. Henderson turned to the woman, annoyed that she was telling him how to handle his property. But then a cruel idea formed in his mind. He looked at the piano sitting in the corner of the large window facing the street. It was a beautiful instrument, brought out for the holiday season to add a touch of class to the dining room. But the musician he had hired for the evening had called in sick. The piano sat silent, bathed in a spotlight, a handout. Mr. Henderson laughed, a short, barking sound that wasn't kind at all. "I don't give handouts. In my restaurant, you work for what you get." He pointed a thick finger at the dusty upright piano on the sidewalk just a few feet away. It was an old upright that the restaurant used for outdoor brunches in the summer. It had been pushed to the side for the winter and was currently covered in a light layer of snow. "You see that?" Mr. Henderson asked the twins. Leo nodded slowly, confused. "If you want food, you play that. If you can play a song that doesn't sound like a dying cat, I'll give you a bowl of the best soup in the city." A few of the people standing outside chuckled. It seemed like a fair joke to them. Dirty street orphans playing classical music. It was like expecting a raccoon to solve a math problem. It was absurd. "You're joking," Leo whispered. He looked at the piano, then back at the angry owner. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Mr. Henderson crossed his arms over his chest. "Play or leave. But let me warn you, if you touch those keys and just make noise, I'll have the police here so fast, your heads will spin." The crowd grew interested now. Someone pulled out a phone to record it, thinking it would be a funny video to show their friends Latera fail video of homeless kids trying to be fancy. "Come on, little rats," the woman in the fur coat said, her voice dripping with malice. "Let's hear a symphony," she laughed, and a few other people joined in. Leo felt a surge of anger deep in his chest. He looked at Milo, who was looking at the piano not with fear, but with a strange kind of longing. Milo loved music. It was the one thing from their old life that they still held on to. Before their parents died, there had been an old piano in their living room. Not a fancy one like this, but a keyboard that worked. Their mother had taught them to play. She said music was the language of the soul, and it didn't matter how much money you had. If you had music in your heart, you were rich. Leo hadn't touched a piano in months. His hands were dirty, his fingers were numb from the cold, and he was terrified. But he looked at Milo, who was shaking so hard his teeth were rattling. His brother needed to eat. It didn't matter if they were laughed at. It didn't matter if they got arrested. At least if they were arrested, they might get a sandwich. "Okay," Leo said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We'll play." The crowd gasped in surprise. They hadn't actually expected the boys to agree. Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "This I have to see," he muttered to the doorman. Leo bent down and helped Milo stand up. He wrapped his arm around Milo's waist. "You lean on me," Leo whispered. "We just play the rain. We can do that in our sleep." Milo nodded, his eyes wide. "I don't know if I can, Leo. My fingers are so cold." "Just follow my hands," Leo said. "Pretend we're back in the living room. Mom is in the kitchen cooking." Slowly, painfully, they walked toward the old upright piano. The snow crunched under their worn-out sneakers. The crowd parted, making a circle around them, giggling and whispering to each other. It felt like a gladiator arena. They were the entertainment for the night. Make way for the maestros. A man in a suit shouted, laughing. The woman in the fur coat made a show of holding her nose as they passed by. "Don't scratch the finish, darling," she said to her husband. Leo felt the heat of shame rising up his neck, but he pushed it down. He focused only on the piano. It was an old black beast, with some of the ivory keys chipped and missing, but to him, it looked like a lifeline. He reached out and brushed the snow off the bench. It was freezing to the touch. He sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold, instantly soaking through his pants. Milo sat down next to him. There was barely enough room for both of them, but they squeezed together. They sat up straight, their dirty coats contrasting horribly with the elegant image of the instrument. Mr. Henderson leaned against the doorframe, watching them closely. He was waiting for the first chaotic noise, the moment he could jump in and say, "I told you so," and chase them away. The crowd was restless. "Hurry it up!" Someone yelled, "Play us a lullaby." Another shouted, followed by a roar of laughter. Leo took a deep breath. The air smelled of car exhaust and expensive perfume. But he closed his eyes for a split second and imagined the smell of their old house lavender and old wood. He felt Milo's trembling leg pressing against his. He knew Milo was scared, but he also knew that once they started playing, Milo wouldn't be scared anymore. The music would take them away from here. Leo placed his hands over the keys. His hands were dirty, the fingernails rimmed with black, and the skin was red and chapped from the frostbite. He looked small behind the massive instrument. "Are you ready?" Leo whispered to Milo. Milo didn't say anything. He just placed his small, pale hands on the higher keys, waiting for the signal. Leo looked out at the crowd. He saw the sneers, the phones held up to record their humiliation, and the impatient face of the restaurant owner. He knew they were expecting a joke. They were expecting a disaster. He took one last breath, filling his lungs with the freezing air, and then he brought his hands down. The first chord was not a mistake. It was clear, sharp, and resonant. It cut through the sound of the wind in the traffic like a knife. It was a C minor chord, full of sadness and power. The laughter in the crowd didn't stop instantly, but it faltered. The man holding his phone lowered it slightly. The woman in the fur coat stopped talking. Leo looked at his brother. Milo was staring at the keys, his face suddenly still. The trembling had stopped. For the first time that night, Milo wasn't cold. He was home. The sound of that first chord seemed to hang in the freezing air, suspended like magic. For a heartbeat, the world went completely silent. The laughter that had been bubbling up from the crowd died a sudden, awkward death. It was as if someone had reached out and turned a volume knob down on the entire street. The people standing there, clutching their expensive coats and holding their fancy drinks, froze. They had expected a mess. They had expected the boys to bang their fists on the keys like angry toddlers, or to plink out a clumsy, disjointed version of Twinkle Twinkle, Little Star. They were ready to mock, to boo, and to feel superior. But the sound that came from the old snow-dusted piano was rich, deep, and terrifyingly perfect. Leo didn't wait for the crowd to catch up. He didn't care about their shock anymore. He was thinking about his mother. He was remembering the way she used to tap her foot when they practiced, keeping the beat steady. He pressed his foot down on the cold pedal, and the music truly began. It wasn't a simple song. It was a complicated, swirling piece of classical music that required 4 hands to play correctly. It was a piece their mother had loved, a song that started slow and sad, like a winter rain, but grew into a storm of powerful, crashing notes. On the left, Leo played the low notes. They were heavy and grounded, providing a heartbeat for the song. His fingers, which were stiff and red from the cold, moved with a grace that seemed impossible. He wasn't looking at his hands. He was looking straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, seeing something that nobody else could see. Then Milo joined in. He played the higher notes, a melody that floated above Leo's heavy rhythm like a bird flying high above a storm. The notes were fast, intricate, and delicate. Milo's small hands danced across the keys. His fingers, which had been too stiff to tie his own shoelaces 10 minutes ago, were now flying. He hit every single note exactly right. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. It was as if the piano was connected directly to his soul. The woman in the fur coat lowered her phone slowly. Her mouth opened slightly, the sneer wiped clean off her face. The man who had been laughing the loudest stopped mid-chuckle. He looked around at his friends, confused, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. Were these really street kids? Was this a reality show prank? Mr. Henderson, the restaurant owner, stood frozen in the doorway. He had his arms crossed, ready to wave them away, but his hands had dropped to his sides. He knew music. He heard classical music every night in his restaurant. He knew that this wasn't just good for beggars. This was good. This was professional. The song began to pick up speed. The boys were perfectly in sync. Leo would lean forward to strike a bass note, and at the exact same moment, Milo would lean back to play a complex run of high notes. They moved together like a single organism. They weren't two shivering, starving orphans anymore. They were masters of their craft. The dirty coats and the matted hair seemed to disappear under the golden light of the street lamp. All that mattered was the music. The melody twisted and turned. It was sad, but there was a fire in it too. It sounded like a struggle. It sounded like two people holding on tight while the world tried to tear them apart. The notes were crying out, soaring high into the night sky. Then, diving deep into the mud, a few people walking by on the other side of the street stopped. They didn't know what was happening, but the sound pulled them in. A taxi driver slowed down his car, rolling down the window to listen. The traffic light turned red, but no one honked their horn. The city seemed to pause just to listen to these two boys. Leo felt a strange warmth spreading through his body. It wasn't from the soup he didn't have yet, and it wasn't from the coat that was too thin. It was the energy of the music. His fingers, which had been numb with frostbite, were now tingling with heat. He poured every ounce of his pain, every memory of his parents, and every moment of hunger he had felt for the last 3 months into the keys. He hit the keys harder, and the piano roared in response. Milo was lost in the sound. He had stopped shivering completely. To him, the cold wind didn't exist. He wasn't sitting on a hard bench in the snow. He was back in his old living room. He could smell the stew his mother used to make. He could feel her hand on his shoulder, steadying him. He played a series of notes so fast and intricate that a few people in the crowd gasped aloud. "How are they doing that?" A young woman whispered to her date. "Look at their hands." "I know," the date replied, his voice hushed. "It doesn't make sense." The song reached its climax. The sound was huge and overwhelming. It washed over the crowd, hitting them in the chest. For the wealthy people standing there in their nice clothes, it was a moment of intense humility. They spent thousands of dollars on tickets to see concerts in fancy halls, and here on the dirty sidewalk, two children with nothing were giving them the best performance of their lives. The woman in the fur coat suddenly felt very foolish. She looked down at her expensive dress, then at the two boys pouring their hearts out. She realized she had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside was more beautiful than she could have imagined. A tear actually rolled down her cheek, ruining her makeup. But she didn't wipe it away. Mr. Henderson felt a lump forming in his throat. He looked at the boys' shoes-worn-out sneakers with holes in the toes and then at their hands, flying across the keys. He thought about the wasted food in his kitchen every night. He thought about how easy it would have been to just give them a bowl of soup without making them dance for it. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, hot and uncomfortable. The music began to slow down. The storm was passing. The fast, frantic notes softened. The melody became gentle again. Milo played a soft, high note that faded into silence like a whisper. Leo played one final deep bass note that resonated through the ground and seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone listening. They lifted their hands off the keys. For a second, there was absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that you only hear after something truly profound has happened. The wind blew, but nobody moved. The traffic light turned green, but nobody moved. The city held its breath. Milo sat up straight and blinked, as if waking up from a trance. The cold air rushed back in, and he instantly started to shivering again. He looked at Leo, his eyes wide, wondering what they were going to do next. Leo looked at his brother and gave a tiny, sad smile. He knew they had played well. He knew they had done exactly what the man asked. But he also knew who he was and where he was. He stood up slowly from the bench, preparing to be mocked, prepared to be told to leave anyway. He looked at the crowd, expecting to see anger or boredom. But that's not what he saw. For a long, dragging moment, nobody moved. The street seemed to be holding its breath, the cold air heavy with the ghost of the music that had just filled it. The final, deep vibrations of the piano string were still humming in the silence, echoing off the brick buildings like a heartbeat slowing down. Leo stood up from the bench, his legs feeling unsteady and weak. He reached out and grabbed Milo's shoulder, pulling his brother to his feet. The magic of the music was fading fast, replaced by the biting reality of the winter wind. Milo stumbled, his small body shivering violently now that the adrenaline had worn off. He looked around at the frozen crowd with wide, frightened eyes, expecting the shouting to start any second. He expected them to be laughed at, or worse, told to leave for being a nuisance. But the laughter didn't come. Slowly, a change rippled through the crowd. It started with the man holding the phone. He slowly lowered his device, his mouth hanging open slightly. He looked at the screen, then back at the boys, completely forgetting to stop the recording. The people who had been sneering and whispering cruel jokes just minutes ago were now standing in stunned silence. Their faces had changed. The arrogance and superiority had been wiped away, replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was an older man standing near the back wearing a simple wool hat. He clapped slowly at first, just a steady, rhythmic 1, 2, 3. It wasn't the polite clapping you give to a child who falls off a bike. It was the clapping you give to respect. The sound seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, the woman in the fur coat burst into applause. She wasn't holding her nose anymore. She was pressing a gloved hand over her heart. Her eyes were wet. The man in the expensive suit joined in, clapping loudly and whistling through his teeth. A few passers-by who had stopped to listen started cheering. Within seconds, the entire sidewalk erupted into a roar of approval. It wasn't just a polite round of applause. It was a tidal wave of noise. People were shouting bravo, an encore. They were stomping their feet, their boots crunching on the snow. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out the traffic noise and the howling wind. Milo shrank back against his brother, terrified by the sudden loud noise. He buried his face in Leo's coat, thinking the crowd was angry. But Leo watched them. He saw tears streaming down the faces of strangers. He saw people looking at each other in disbelief, shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. The reaction wasn't just about the music. It was about the contrast between what they saw and what they heard. In their minds, homeless children were supposed to be uneducated, dirty, and talentless. These boys had just shattered that stereotype into a million pieces. They had taken a beautiful instrument and made it sing with a voice that came from the soul. The crowd realized they had almost missed something miraculous, because they were too busy judging the packaging. The front door of the restaurant opened with a jingle of bells. Mr. Henderson stepped out onto the sidewalk. The noise of the crowd died down slightly as people turned to look at him. Mr. Henderson looked different now. His face, which had been red and angry just moments ago, was pale. He looked at the twins, who were huddled together by the piano. And then he looked at the expectant faces of his customers. He had prepared himself to mock the boys. He had prepared to chase them away to prove a point about hard work and worth. Instead, he had just been taught a lesson about dignity and talent by two 10-year-olds who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Mr. Henderson walked over to the piano. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at the boys. He stopped in front of them, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He saw the fear in their eyes, the resignation that they were going to be yelled at regardless of how well they played. It made him feel small. "You," Mr. Henderson started, his voice gruff and quiet. He cleared his throat, trying to find his commanding voice, but it was gone. "You boys have a gift." Leo looked up at him, wary. "We played the song," Leo said simply. "You said you would give us soup." The woman in the fur coat stepped forward, unable to stay quiet. "Give them more than soup, Henderson," she cried out, her voice shrill with emotion. "Look at them. They're freezing." The crowd murmured in agreement. "Yeah, give them a real meal." A man shouted. Mr. Henderson looked at the boys' tattered shoes and their thin coats. He looked at Milo, who was trembling so hard he looked like a leaf in a storm. The owner let out a long breath. The steam rose from his lips and mingled with the cold air. He realized that acting like a tyrant wasn't worth it. Not tonight. Not after what he had heard. Of course, Mr. Henderson said loudly so the crowd could hear, "A deal is a deal." He gestured toward the open door of the restaurant. "Come inside. Both of you." Now, the crowd cheered again, stepping aside to make a path for the boys. Leo tightened his grip on Milo's hand. "Come on," he whispered. "We're going in." He walked slowly toward the golden light spilling out of the restaurant. As they passed the crowd, people reached out. Some of them wanted to pat them on the back. Others just wanted to touch their coats, as if they were royalty. It was a strange sensation for the twins. For months, people had been pretending they didn't exist. Now everyone wanted a piece of them. They stepped over the threshold. The warmth of the restaurant hit them like a wall. It was intoxicating. The air smelled of roasted garlic, butter, fresh bread, and coffee. It was the smell of life. The noise of the wind faded away, replaced by the clinking of silverware and low, murmured conversation. The patrons inside stopped eating as the two dirty boys walked in. A waiter walked past with a tray full of steaming bowls, the rich broth glistening under the chandeliers. Milo stared at the tray, his eyes glazed, unable to look away. He had forgotten just how beautiful food could look. Mr. Henderson led them to a small table in the corner, usually reserved for waiters on break. "Sit," he commanded, but his voice wasn't harsh. "Sit there." Leo pulled out the chair for Milo. Milo sat down, almost collapsing with relief. The chair was padded with velvet. It felt like sitting on a cloud. Leo sat next to him, keeping his back straight, trying to maintain some sense of dignity despite the dirt on his face. The restaurant was buzzing now. Everyone was talking about the performance on the sidewalk. "Did you see their hands?" one man was saying. "It was like they were born with ivory keys attached to their fingers." Mr. Henderson clapped his hands loudly, summoning his head chef, a big man with a white apron. The chef came out of the kitchen, looking annoyed at the interruption until he saw the twins. "Get them the stew," Mr. Henderson said to the chef. "The big bowls. And fresh bread. And I want 2 hot chocolates with whipped cream." "Hurry up!" The chef looked at the boys, really looked at them, and his expression softened. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded vigorously and rushed back to the kitchen. Within minutes, 2 steaming bowls were placed on the table in front of the boys. The smell was incredible. It was a thick beef stew with chunks of carrot, potato, and meat floating in a dark, savory broth. Next to the bowls was a basket of warm, crusty bread, still soft in the middle. For a second, neither boy moved. They just stared at the food, terrified that if they reached for it, it would disappear. "It felt too good to be true," Mr. Henderson said, standing over them. "You earned it." Milo didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a spoon with a trembling hand and shoveled a spoonful into his mouth. He didn't even chew. He just swallowed, desperate to get something into his stomach. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he let out a small, happy moan. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Leo was more cautious. He picked up a piece of bread and tore off a small piece. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. The flavor exploded on his tongue. He felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away. He looked around the room. Everyone was watching them, smiling. The woman in the fur coat was dabbing her eyes with a napkin at her own table. But as the warmth of the soup began to spread through Leo's chest, he felt a familiar anxiety. This was a meal, yes. But what about tomorrow? And the day after? The soup was wonderful, but it wasn't a home. He looked down at his hands, resting on the clean white tablecloth. They were still dirty, the nails still black. For 1 hour, they had been magic. But now, they were just the hands of a beggar again. The restaurant door opened again, letting in a blast of cold air. The room went quiet as a new figure walked in. He was a tall man with silver hair and a long coat, carrying a briefcase. He had a distinguished air about him, the kind of person who commanded respect when he walked into a room. He stopped just inside the door, looking around for a table, till his eyes locked on the 2 boys in the corner. He saw the empty bowls. He saw the steam rising from the mugs. But mostly, he saw the way they held themselves. He walked toward their table, ignoring the mater d who tried to greet him. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze intense and curious. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I was outside. I heard the music." Leo looked up, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Yes, sir," Leo said quietly. The stranger didn't look at Mr. Henderson or the crowd. He only looked at Leo and Milo. "That was Beethoven's Pathetic," the stranger said, "and you played it with more emotion than I have heard in years." The stranger set his briefcase down on the floor and leaned in close to the table. The entire restaurant leaned in with him. "My name is Dr. Thorne," the stranger said gently, "and I have to know, where did you learn to play like that?" Leo looked at the man standing by their table. The stranger had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and he didn't look at the dirt on Leo's face or the rags he was wearing. He was looking at Leo as if he were a real person, someone important. "Our mother taught us," Leo said quietly. He glanced down at his hands, which were resting on the table, finally starting to feel warm again. She had an old keyboard. She said music was the only thing nobody could ever take away from us. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "She was right," he said softly. "And she was a very good teacher." He turned to look at Milo, who was busy scraping the last bit of broth from his bowl with his spoon. "And your brother?" "He has perfect pitch. It is rare. Very rare." The restaurant was dead silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch the interaction at the corner table. Mr. Henderson stood a few feet away, feeling like a spectator in his own restaurant. He watched as Dr. Thorne reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card. He placed it gently on the table, right next to the empty bread basket. "I run the Conservatory of Music downtown," Dr. Thorne said. "It is a school for children who have talent but perhaps not the means to afford it. We have housing. We have food. And we have pianos." Keo stared at the card. It was white with black writing, simple and elegant. He didn't dare touch it. "A school?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "For us?" "For you," Dr. Thorne corrected gently. "If you want it." The audition was tonight on the sidewalk. You passed. Tears finally spilled over Leo's eyelids and ran down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt. He had been holding on to his strength for so long, protecting his brother, trying to survive, that the sudden offer of safety was almost too much to handle. He looked at Milo, who was now looking up, a piece of bread hanging from his mouth, confused by the tears in his brother's eyes. "Does that mean we get to sleep inside?" Milo asked, his innocent voice ringing clearly through the room. A few people in the restaurant let out soft laughs. They were kind laughs, full of warmth. Dr. Thorne smiled. "Yes, young man. That means you get to sleep inside. Every night. In a warm bed. And you will go to school, and you will play music every day." Milo's eyes went wide. He swallowed his bread and looked at the stranger. "And we can eat soup like this every day?" "I can't promise soup this good every day," Dr. Thorne chuckled, glancing at Mr. Henderson. "But you will never go hungry again." "That is a promise." Mr. Henderson finally stepped forward. He cleared his throat, looking a bit uncomfortable, but also humbled. "Dr. Thorne, if these boys need references, or clothes, or—" He trailed off, realizing how ridiculous he sounded, offering charity to a man who had just offered a life, but Dr. Thorne just shook his hand. "I think we can manage from here, but thank you. You did a good thing tonight, even if it started the wrong way." Mr. Henderson looked down at the twins. "Finish your soup," he grumbled, but he was smiling. "And take these." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 $20 bills, pressing them into Leo's hand. "For now. Just in case." Leo looked at the money, then at the restaurant owner. He wanted to say thank you, but the words caught in his throat. He just nodded. The woman in the fur coat came over to the table. She placed a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "You boys are going to do great things," she said. "Never forget that song you played tonight. It changed us." One by one, people stopped by or waved from their seats. It wasn't just pity anymore. It was respect. The twins had transformed from a nuisance into celebrities in the span of 10 minutes. When the soup was gone and the mugs of hot chocolate were empty, Dr. Thorne helped them out of their chairs. "My car is right outside," he said. "We can go to the school tonight. There are beds waiting, and I imagine you are both exhausted." Leo stood up. His legs were still weak, but for the first time in months, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He looked around the gilded spoon one last time. He saw the beautiful piano in the corner and the empty tables. It was a place he never thought he would enter, and a place he never thought he would leave as a guest. He looked at Milo. Milo nodded, his eyes shining. "Yeah, I want to play the piano at the school." "Me too," Leo said. They followed Dr. Thorne to the door. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Leo braced himself for the wind. But it didn't feel as sharp anymore. Dr. Thorne opened the back door of a long black car parked by the curb. It was warm inside, with soft leather seats. The twins climbed in, sinking deep into the cushions, as Dr. Thorne got into the front seat and the car began to move away from the curb. Leo looked out the window. The crowd was still standing on the sidewalk. They were waving goodbye. Mr. Henderson was standing in the doorway of his restaurant, watching them go. He raised a hand in a slow farewell. The car drove through the city streets, passing the alleyways where they had slept, passing the grates where they had huddled for warmth. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. Leo leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes. He could hear the hum of the engine, a steady, low rumble that sounded like a lullaby. He thought about the piano sitting on the sidewalk, cold and dusty. It had been their last hope, and it had worked. But he knew it wasn't just the piano. It was his mother's lessons, echoing in his memory. It was Milo, who had played his heart out even when he was starving. It was them together. Milo, who had already fallen asleep with his head on Leo's shoulder, let out a soft sigh. Leo wrapped his arm around his brother, holding him tight. He wasn't scared of tomorrow anymore. He knew that when the sun came up, they wouldn't be waking up on the cold pavement. They would be waking up in a new world, a world where they weren't invisible beggars. They were musicians, and they were going to be just fine. The car turned a corner, carrying the two brothers toward their future, leaving the cold, dark streets behind them forever. The music was over, but the song of their life was just beginning.